Shandian Begay gripped his wrist and whispered, "No one ever kissed me." Calter Vale froze at the canyon's seep spring, water ticking from limestone into his cupped palm. He'd found her here 3 dusks in a row, same juniper shade, same braids sliding over her shoulder, same careful watchfulness that said she trusted silence far more than men. The 4th dusk, she'd closed the distance, fingers warm around his skin, an admission trembling between them like the spring itself. He searched her face. A breath of wind lifted the loose hairs along her temple. Shandian didn't look away. She had asked the world for something small and impossible, honesty wrapped in a kiss. Calter set the water aside, wiped his hand on his shirt, and bent. Their lips met, no more than a brush, the barest proof of promise. It didn't feel like stolen fire. It felt like a door quietly opening. Shandian's throat tightened with a wonder she tried not to show. The brazen part of her wanted to laugh, to tell him she'd said it only to see if the cowboy would flinch. The true part of her wanted to memorize the way his breath steadied when he touched her, how gentleness could be a kind of strength. She stepped back first, because her grandmother's lessons were woven tight, one is a spark, a life is the fire pit that must hold it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The spring went on ticking. A cicada wound up its rasp in the willow. Calter cleared his throat. "You said nobody ever." "I said what I meant," Shandian answered, heat tinting the high bones of her cheeks. She was 20 summers by her grandmother's count, old enough to choose, old enough to be chosen, and stubborn enough to do both on her own terms. "I didn't say kiss me again." He smiled like a man who knew fences were suggestions at best. "Then I'll wait until you ask." "You won't." She said it because she needed to hear herself set a line. "You'll get bored." Cowboys always get bored. "I get hungry, mostly," he said, glancing at the sky where swallows cut blue seams between clouds. "For work that matters. For water that won't run out. For quiet." He let the last word hang, and Shandian realized he'd left a space there with her name in it. A distant clatter rolled through the canyon, the sound of iron shoes taking stone, and both of them turned. Shandian heard hoofbeats with more than ears, she felt them in the way the willow leaves quivered, in the tiny pause of the spring's rhythm when the horse's weight shook the ledge above. "Go," she said. "Your people." Calter cocked his head, listening the way men on open country learn to listen, shoulders, ground, sky. "Not mine." He tipped his chin toward the rim. "Hear the chain? That's a drag harrow. Only one man in Whisper Basin hauls that behind a pair before dusk, Ezra Pike." Shandian knew that name. Everyone did. Ezra Pike had pushed fences like a tide across grass that remembered other promises. His men drank hard and rode harder and used water as leverage. Calter read the set of her mouth. "I work for the Bosque Cooperative now. We pool wages, not cattle. Build where we can without taking. We're trying a different kind of ranch." She gave him a look that weighed words against deeds. "Trying is a word for boys." "I know," he said softly. "And I'm done being one." The drag harrow rasped across the upper bench, tearing at soil that held seeds and bones and stories. Shandian's hand tightened around her braid. She hadn't planned to meet him today, not after Trading Post gossip put his name in the same sentences as Pike's men last winter. But Calter Vale had stopped saying the word sorry like it was a coin he could pay with. He'd started showing up with salt and flour when wind stripped her grandmother's drying racks. He'd kept the wolves off their winter sheep without taking credit. He'd learned to say dine before Navajo, and to ask rather than guess. Now he stood as if he'd take the drag harrow in his shoulders if it meant the willow roots could keep their grip. "Come," Shandian said, and led him along the goat track only kids and does trusted. They climbed to a slot in the rock that gave a view of the bench. The sunset burned a copper seam along the mesa's lip. Ezra Pike's team stood in silhouette, breath like steam ghosts. A man behind them, hat brim sharp as a blade, muscled the harrow forward, tearing furrows toward a seat that fed the spring below. "They'll choke our water," Shandian said. The words were even, but she felt them scrape. "They'll try," Coulter answered. "But the seep is older than their maps. It's fed by impervious layer, shale under limestone. That harrow won't touch it." "Will their paper work?" she asked without sarcasm. "They post papers and men in blue uniforms come." Coulter didn't pretend not to hear the memory in her voice. The last time papers arrived, a cousin's camp was pushed to the Rocky Flats. The cooperative filed too. "With names you can't erase easy." He swallowed. "Including mine." Shandian measured him again, adding this, a man willing to put ink where his mouth was. On the bench, Ezra Pike swung from the saddle. He wasn't driving the team, he was directing cruelty like a foreman directs time. He pointed at the seep, then at the harrow, then at the ground as if ownership was something you could force with gestures. Two of his riders laughed. Shandian's jaw clenched. "My grandmother says names matter more than fences. She made me learn the old names for these washes and mesas. That seep is called water that remembers. Water doesn't forget." Coulter's voice gentled. "Then let it remember us standing here." She looked at him, not at the hat brim or the holster or the denim gone gray with honest wear, but at the way he held still when Land was talking. A bell inside her rang, a sound she recognized from ceremonial mornings when corn pollen dusted her knuckles and the world felt braced between breath and song. She knew enough to keep such bells to herself. "We have to warn my grandmother," she said, pivoting toward the switchback that dropped to the hogan. "If Pike puts a post in the seep's throat, there will be trouble. Not just with my clan. With the land." Coulter nodded and followed, careful where he put his weight. He'd learned that from the sheep trails too. The hogan smelled like cedar smoke and wool and juniper sap, the kind of clean that comes from leaving a door open to weather and work. Grandmother Tazba sat near the hearth, legs folded, a weaving stretched on the loom before her. Her hands moved like good river water, unhurried, unstoppable. She didn't glance up when Shandian ducked inside, because Grandmother Tazba believed drama shriveled if you didn't feed it eye contact. "Yaddy," Shandian said softly. "Yaddy," Tazba answered, her voice as steady as the loom's crossbar. "Who is with you?" "Coulter Vale." Shandian tasted each syllable like a test. "From the cooperative." "That is a man's name put on a boy once." Tazba's fingers paused on the weft. "Has he grown into it?" "He's trying," Shandian said before she could stop herself. Tazba's mouth tipped at the corner. "Trying is the word for boys." Coulter ducked in and removed his hat as if he were stepping into a church. "Ma'am." Tazba looked at him the way storms look at dry grass. "Sit," she said, and he did, because there are voices that don't ask twice. They told her about the drag harrow, about Ezra Pike's riders, about water that remembers. Tazba listened, her hands never idle. When they were done, she lifted one palm, and Shandian fell silent with the relief of someone who'd been heard. "This is old," Tazba said. "Older than you. Older than me. Men come with iron and paper. We greet them with breath and patience. Sometimes they leave. Sometimes they return with more men. Always, the water knows what it is." She tied off a weft, tugged it firm. "But you still tell the chapter house. And the cooperative. And Tomas at the trading post because his brother-in-law likes to talk in the wrong places. Words wander. Let them wander where they can do some good." Coulter nodded. "We'll file protest, ma'am. And we'll put men between the harrow and the seep if we have to." "You'll put men?" Tazba asked, and Coulter felt the question land where it was supposed to, on the thin line between savior and neighbor. He took the hit and bowed his head. "We'll stand with you, if you ask. We won't stand instead of you." Tazba watched him a while, then went back to her weaving, which is how she said yes. At the trading post, the air braided coffee with saddle soap and sun-baked wood. Tomas kept the ledger with one hand and broke up card games with the other. A bell over the door put a small halo of sound around anyone foolish enough to think he could slip in quiet. When Shandian walked in with Coulter, conversation hiccuped. Everyone knew a story when it wrote itself in front of them. Evening, Tomas said, which in this room meant, I will let you speak for yourself before I let others speak for you. Shandian did, because her grandmother had asked. She told about the harrow, about pike, about water that remembers. She used the Dine name for the wash and watched men straighten as if their spines recognized something older than county lines. Tomas scratched the ledger, glanced at Coulter, then at a lanky woman mending a bridle by the window. Ruthie, he said, tell Eli to put the team in the yard and bring the chain. Ezra's men don't get to cut new swales on community ground without a talk. A boy in a bucket hat, too big for his head, too small for his ambitions, piped up from the candy barrel. What about the law? The law comes when it's ready, Tomas said. We go now. Men and women stood, worn hands finding rope and pry bars, shoulders remembering how to move together. Coulter found himself calibrating without meaning to, who could swing a sledge, who could talk a fuse out of lighting, who would stand between haunted history and hot-headed youth. He caught himself and stopped. This wasn't a cattle drive. This was a river of people choosing not to be flood or drought but banks. On the porch outside, Ruthie flicked her chin at Shandian. He yours? Shandian blinked. No, the word came too fast and too slow. Ruthie grinned without malice. Good. Make him earn it. The small procession moved out, wagons and riders and a woman walking with a pry bar on her shoulder like a flag. Dust lifted behind them in a ribbon that looked from a distance like a promise heading toward a seam in the land. They reached the bench as last lights slid between juniper and sky. Ezra Pike had driven the team so close to the seep you could hear water murmur objection in the harrow's teeth. His riders, 5 of them, relaxed in the posture of men who didn't need to count when they had a name like Ezra's to stand in front of them. Tomas halted and raised a hand in greeting that wasn't quite peace and wasn't quite challenge. Evening, Ezra. Evening, Pike answered, smile like a split board. Haul that chain back to your barn, Tomas. We're improving drainage. Ruthie planted her pry bar. You're carving a throat. It's private land. He gestured at a stake with a pink ribbon. Survey says so. Shandian stepped forward before she thought to be afraid. That water has another name. Water that remembers. It remembers who stood here. It remembers who took and who gave back. If you cut it, it will remember that too. Ezra studied her a beat longer than he meant to. And who are you? Someone who drinks here, she said. Tomas's voice was even. Chapter protests filed. County clerk stamped it before supper. You can wait a week, Ezra. Or you can force your luck and make the sheriff ride out tomorrow mad at your paperwork instead of at me. Ezra's smile never warmed. Sheriff eats at my table. And buys flour at mine, Tomas said. You gonna starve his kids to make a point? The riders shifted. This was the kind of talk that put splinters in a man's boots. Coulter felt the moment tilt. He stepped into Ezra's line of sight without crowding it. Evening, sir. Ezra's eyes lit with recognition and a pleasure not at all fatherly. Well, I'll be. Ain't you one of mine? Not anymore, Coulter said, throat dry. I hired on with the cooperative. Collective barn raising for boys with soft hands, Ezra drawled. You were good with a rope, Vale. Shame to see you tangle yourself in one. Coulter kept his voice steady. I learned who paid wages and who paid a place forward. That's all. Ezra's gaze slid to Shandian as if she were a rung on a ladder he had already climbed. She teach you that? No, Coulter said, and let the one beat of truth land. She taught me patience. A rider snorted. From the look of him, boss, he could use more. Tomas shifted the chain off his shoulder. We're not here to trade insults. You can turn that team back 20 yards and prove you know how to be a neighbor, or we can all stand here until the moon gets bored and the sheriff has to wake up. Ezra spat into the dust, weighed the odds, and picked today's fight to lose. He raised his hand and the team backed. The harrow teeth left the seep's shoulder like a bully leaving a lunch table without finishing his little speech. He tipped his hat with 2 fingers. "We're not done," he said, and rode off with that special kind of dignity losers wrap around themselves like a shawl. The cooperative and the chapter people stayed until the moon cleared the mesa and the seep ran glassy as a held breath. When they finally broke apart, it was with the relief of a cattle herd that smelled lightning and found it a county over. Coulter walked Shandian back to the switchback. They didn't speak. Words would have been a kind of noise. At the notch above the spring, she stopped him with a palm on his chest. "You were steady." He shook his head. "I wanted to show off." "You didn't," she said. "That's steadiness." She glanced toward the shadowed sage, where night animals made the kind of ordinary racket that sounds like comfort. "Ask." He swallowed. "Ask what?" "Ask to kiss me again," she said, and hated how brave that made her feel. He didn't reach right away. He checked her eyes, her shoulders, the set of her mouth, the angle of her stance. When he saw yes in all of it, he leaned in and took his time. When he pulled back, he stayed close enough that she could feel his words on her cheek. "I'm not good at running. I'm better at staying and learning how to be good." "Then stay," she said, meaning tonight and tomorrow and whatever came with both. He laughed, quiet and startled, like a boy who'd been told he could sleep inside for once. "I will." He didn't go. He followed her down the switchback to the hogan, where Tazba had made coffee thin as patience. They sat on the ground and drank it from chipped cups while bats stitched the sky above them and a coyote read the evening's news from the ridge. For the first time in a year, Shandian's heartbeat matched the country's. Morning made a clean promise and then broke it by noon. A dust column when you don't expect one is a kind of telegram. By the time Shandian saw it from the loom's doorway, she knew it meant riders, and by the way the dust held tight to the road, she knew it meant men who thought they had permission to be loud. She met them halfway to the seep with Ruthie and Tomas and 3 elders who walked in a patience that made horses shy. Coulter came from the far pasture at a hard lope, sliding from the saddle in time to hear the sheriff's first sentence. "I've got a court order," Sheriff Milner said, holding a paper like a badge could turn into a shovel. "Ezra Pike's granted temporary access for drainage improvement." Tomas took the paper, read it, handed it to Ruthie, who read it slower, then gave it to Tazba, who didn't read it at all. "We're not a sink," she said, as if the land itself were speaking. "We're a spring." "That's poetry," Milner replied, "and I'm here for law." "Law without listening is a harrow with nobody holding the reins," Tazba said. Milner reddened. "Stand aside." Shandian felt the slippage, the minute when a talk becomes a shove. She stepped forward because her body moved before her fear could. "Sheriff," she said, "if you put iron in that throat today, the water will run brown for a season. Every child in 2 miles will taste dust at supper. You can ride home with Ezra Pike and drink coffee in a dry kitchen." "We can't." The sheriff looked at her for the first time. He looked away because something in his face didn't like the mirror he found. "I'm sorry," he said, and Shandian filed the sound of a white man saying that in the wrong place in her bones. "Stand aside." Ruthie planted her pry bar again. "Or what?" Milner's deputies unhooked the harrow and took a step in a direction Shandian had learned to hate. Coulter moved with them, but not as part of them. He moved to place his body where damage would land first. "Sheriff," Tomas said, "you make this a fight and Ezra owns you until winter. You make it a delay and you can still eat at both our tables." Milner stared at the paper like it might tell him how to be a man. "I have to." "No," said a voice from the ridge. It wasn't a shout. It didn't need to be. Men stopped because some words carried more weight than iron. A rider appeared on the skyline, horse black as the shadow under thunderheads. Another followed. Then 4 more. They didn't ride fast. They rode like people who already owned enough time not to hurry. Coulter didn't curse, but he felt the air thin in his chest. He knew those silhouettes, knew the first rider's easy seat and the scar that turned his right profile into a rumor. Yazinez. Shandian's mother's brother. The clan's war shirt when war could only be contained by a shirt. The man who barreled laughter like whiskey and kept his anger bone dry for when it would burn brightest. He rode down the slope with his men fanned behind like a hawk's feathers. He barely glanced at the sheriff or Ezra's paper. He looked at Shandian. Then he looked at Coulter. "Come here, Shoddy," he said to Shandian, using the old word from my younger sister's child, except there was nothing gentle in it today. Shandian walked up the wash until she could see his eyes. She remembered him picking her up in one arm when she was small and setting her on a horse like he was telling the world he trusted her feet. She remembered his hand heavy on her head the day her father died. She remembered his face the week he returned from down south with stories about men in blue coats and trains that ran like a bad dream through someone else's house. "You bring this," Yazzie said, sweeping a hand that caught Harrow and Sheriff in Ezra's absence and Coulter's presence all in one gesture, "into our water?" Shandian's voice tried to split. She kept it whole. "I brought truth to grandmother. The water brought everyone else." Yazzie's gaze moved to Coulter. "And you?" Coulter's mouth dried. "I brought a body that won't let iron cut a spring." Yazzie studied him the way wolves study a fence. "Is that the same body that kissed my niece under willow shade?" Heat climbed Shandian's neck. Grandmother Tazba's breath made a soft sound that might have been a prayer or a curse. Coulter didn't look away. "Yes." The ridgeline held its breath. Ruthie shifted the pry bar to her other hand. Tomas didn't move at all. Yazzie's horse blew, stamping at flies that turned the morning's clean promise sour. "You think you can drink from our spring and put your mouth on our girl and ride away easy?" "No," Coulter said. "I think I can learn to stay hard." He felt his face go hot at the double edge in his own words and refused to take them back. Yazzie's eyes narrowed a fraction, then smoothed as if he'd filed the boy in front of him into a shape he could carry without cutting his hand. "You'll step aside with your sheriff," he said, "and we will talk. Dine first. Then neighbors." Milner bristled like a cat too close to a fire. "I have a court." "Sheriff," Tomas said quietly, "take the piece of paper and your men to the shade for 10 minutes. Let people who know this place decide how to keep it alive. You can still be the man who chose listening." Milner looked at the two crowds and picked the part of himself that wanted to be invited to more tables. He nodded, signaled his deputies, and they pulled back to the cottonwoods where a breeze found them and a blue jay scolded like a trickster with an audience. Yazzie dismounted without looking at Coulter. He stood with the elders, with Tazba, with Ruthie and Tomas and Shandian, and the words went the way words sometimes go when they're trying to become a bridge over a canyon cut by years. They were careful. They were sharp when they had to be. They allowed pride to stand without being fed. They allowed fear to speak first and be corrected by love. Coulter waited. It was the hardest work he'd done since he quit Ezra's string. When they were done, Yazzie finally turned fully toward him. "You will come tonight," he said. "You will sit outside my fire and answer questions." Coulter inclined his head. "Yes." "You will not touch my niece in the dark between now and then." Coulter nodded. "Yes." "You will bring your truth and leave your pride." "Yes." Yazzie looked back at Shandian with a final measure. "Don't love a man because he knows how to promise. Love him if he knows how to keep a place." Shandian swallowed and said nothing because she had already begun to do both and didn't yet know which was braver. The sheriff came back, paper damp with sweat. "What's the decision?" Tomas didn't bother to hide the relief in his voice when he answered. "We're standing the Harrow aside until the judge hears protest. If Ezra wants to bring it, he'll bring it after a weekend when everyone's had time to count who their neighbors really are." Milner allowed his shoulders to drop. "All right." He tucked the paper away like a bad hand in a card game. "All right." Yazzie swung back into the saddle. "Tonight," he said to Coulter, and then to Shandian, softer, almost weary, "bring your grandmother's blessing or don't bring yourself." He rode off along the ridge, his men falling in behind like low thunder. Shandian watched the day break itself into chores and small kindnesses, then into worry and the sticky fly buzz of waiting. Tazba moved through the hogan like a steady prayer. She packed corn mush into a clay bowl for supper and spoke into the room in a tone that turned panic into tasks. "You will take corn pollen," she said. "You will not answer questions that do not belong to the night. You will not make yourself smaller to be loved. And you will not grow yourself bigger to be feared." "I don't want him to be afraid," Shandian said. "Then you must not be," Tazba replied, which was the kind of medicine you can only get from old women. At dusk, Coulter came up the wash on foot, hat in his hands, hair combed like he might be inspected by a captain. He didn't step into the circle. He stood at its edge where the dirt held footprints like a ledger holds names. Yazi's fire was small and precise, a handprint of flame cupped by stone. Men sat as if they were part of the ground itself. One by one, they asked Coulter questions. He answered all of them like a man who was more afraid of his own lies than of anyone else's anger. "Why did you leave Ezra Pike?" "Because I watched a calf die of thirst at a fence when water was 100 yards away, and I couldn't stand the sound or the man who told me to let it make me tougher." "What do you want from Shandian?" "The chance to learn how to deserve standing near her." "What do you think this land owes you?" "Nothing. I owe it." "Will you fight if we ask?" "I will stand where you stand. I will not pretend to lead where I don't know the road." They listened. It took the shape of a test and the shape of something kinder. At the end, Yazi said, "You are not turned away." He didn't say, "You are accepted." Gifts come slow from men who know wait. Coulter breathed and felt the air go all the way to his feet for the first time all day. Shandian wanted to reach for his hand. She didn't. She reached for courage instead. Yazi poured coffee for the men and only then looked at his niece. "Walk with me," he said, the way he had years ago when he took her up the ridge and taught her where lightning hides. She rose and followed him to the shadow line where the fire's small light stopped arguing with night. "You brought a cowboy to our water," he said, not a question. "I brought a man," she answered. Yazi grunted, which in his grammar meant, "I acknowledge the difference and reserve the right to challenge it later." He tipped his chin at Coulter. He knows how to say the right thing without tasting his own words first. He learned to taste tonight. "That's good." Shandian swallowed. "Do you trust him?" "I trust the questions he asked himself before he came." Yazi turned so she could see the whites in his eyes. "But I don't trust the world to let a man like that be simple." Before she could ask what that meant, a horse blew hard down the wash. Another. The sound came wrong, no bell, no jingle, just breath like torn cloth. Then the dry clack of hooves on rock, too many hooves, too fast, a staccato that said panic had put its hand on something and shoved. Coulter and Tomas were already moving. Ruthie snatched the pry bar as if iron could answer iron. Sheriff Milner stepped to the edge of the dark with his hand near his holster, eyes narrowed at a danger he hadn't been paid to imagine. A rider exploded from the wash with no saddle and no hat, just hair full of cottonwood leaves and eyes big enough to swallow the stars. "Fire," he gasped, pointing back the way he'd come. "On the bench. It's running like a dog." "And—" He didn't finish because the bench itself spoke, a blossom of orange against the mesa lip, bright enough to paint faces in terror. Behind it, another hot bloom, and another, in a line. "Backfire," Tomas said, voice a knife. "Pike." Ruthie didn't curse. She saved her breath for running. "Wind's wrong," she barked. "If the canyon drafts, it'll funnel the flames down the seep. It'll cook the willow and boil the spring." Yazi's men moved like a single body waking, ropes grabbed, blankets yanked from saddles, water sloshed into tubs and split into coffee pots and buckets and hats. The sheriff went pale in a way that meant he finally saw whose names would be on the paper if the spring died, his most of all. Coulter met Shandian's eyes and saw something there that had nothing to do with kissing and everything to do with choosing. "I'm going," he said. "I know," she answered. "So am I." "Stay with your grandmother," he said, because good men always say the wrong safe thing first. "She's already ahead of us," Shandian replied, and she was. Tazba had gathered wet cloths and a jar of corn pollen and was walking toward the wash with the kind of dignity that turns chaos into a line people can follow. They ran. Feet pounded dust into a smell like old rain. Horses fought bits and then accepted them because hands they trusted held the reins. Sparks lifted on the first gust and went searching for trouble. At the bench, fire licked the dry grass with a tongue that would never be satisfied. The harrow cuts Ezra laid yesterday had made little gutters for flame. It took the gift. Anchor the right. Ruthie shouted. Drag wet line from the seep. Buckets. Tomas added. Don't throw, lay. He swung his arm in a motion that flattened water onto grass, smothering flame instead of feeding it air. Yazzie led his men along the flank, beating the head with wet coats, driving stakes in where wind tried to snake under and turn the line. Sheriff Milner surprised everyone by moving like a man who had once been useful. He took smoke in his throat and kept talking, counting beats, making the frantic look like choreography. Coulter grabbed a wet blanket and ran the edge with Shandian at his side. Heat seared their faces. Embers landed on their sleeves and died the way bad ideas do when they meet good work. The fire tried 3 flanks and found people on all of them. It should have been enough. A gust came down the wash the wrong way, the canyon's breath taking itself in too fast. Flame lifted, leapt the wet line like a deer, and bit the willow's skirts. Shandian heard the spring scream. She didn't know water could do that. She swung her blanket and missed and swung again and hit, and the heat slapped her so hard she staggered. Coulter caught her elbow and shoved her back into balance without stealing her task. Under. Ruthie yelled. It's under. The willow's roots burned like someone had poured whiskey where they should have poured prayer. Dig. Yazzie thundered, and men went to their knees with hands and shovels and anything sharp enough to make a trench. They carved a U around the roots that mattered most and threw water into the U until it steamed. The seep coughed brown and then ran clear because water keeps its promises when people do. For one long minute, the fire and the people argued as equals. Then the wind turned its shoulder and the argument tilted. Hold! Tomas shouted, and they did. Just a breath more, Ruthie grunted, soaking a blanket and smothering a snake of flame trying to slide out of the U like a liar leaving a story. Hold, Yazzie said again, and it sounded like he was talking to Shandian, to her courage, to her fear. They held. The head broke. The flank died like a bad rumor in a good kitchen. The last tongues went out with the kind of hiss a kettle makes when you take it off the boil before it scalds the child. No one cheered. They stood and shook ash from sleeves and spit black and watched the willow drip trouble away. That was started, Tomas said into the quiet that follows almost loss. Not an accident. A line of points. A smart wind. Sheriff Milner hunched his shoulders. I'll. Go on, Ruthie said, not unkind. Say it, you'll investigate. He swallowed the rest of the sentence and nodded instead. Coulter took 2 steps back from the seep and realized his hands were shaking. He looked at Shandian and found her watching him with the kind of blue steady you only get after you've stood in heat and not run. He wanted to kiss her so badly his mouth ached. He didn't. He picked up a shovel and started covering the U with wet earth. Shandian knelt and worked beside him. Their shoulders bumped. That was plenty. When they finished, Yazzie stepped up. He looked at the willow, then at the people who had kept it from dying, then at Coulter like a man who has adjusted the load on his horse and finds the weight bearable for another mile. You will come in the morning, he said to Coulter. We will ride the fence line together. You will show me where your old boss teaches men to write their names in fire. Coulter nodded. Yes. Yazzie lifted his chin toward the dark beyond the ridge. And tonight, he added, voice gone quieter and harder all at once, you will come because a man is at my fire asking for my niece's hand with a knife in his voice. The night seemed to pull itself tighter. Shandian felt the ground tilt the way it does when you step from rock to ice. Who? She asked, though a part of her belly already knew. Ashkiai Benali, Yazzie said, and the name landed like a stone dropped in a well. His mother's sister promised years ago, when your father was still laughing. He has cows and a new wagon and a mouth that's learned to speak nice where it's heard no too often. He came after the first harrow pass and before the sheriff's paper. He waited until you had ash on your face to be sure we'd see how helpful he looked beside it. Coulter's hands closed around the shovel handle because he didn't trust them empty. Yazzy's eyes flicked to that small surrender and then back to his niece. He'll say arrangement. He'll say duty. He'll say the old promises count more than the new ones. Shandian's mouth went dry. And what will you say? Yazzy's expression didn't shift, but his voice did. I'll say the fire nearly caught the spring tonight, and men who love you will be measured by whether they hold water or throw spark. He let the sentence settle and then added, almost gently, come. Your grandmother is waiting, with words that hurt and heal in the same breath. Shandian turned, feeling ash crackle where sweat had glued it to her skin. Coulter started to move with her and stopped when Yazzie lifted one palm. Not you, Yazzie said. Not yet. Coulter took the step he'd already taken and put it back where it belonged. Yes. He tasted ash and the copper of his own restraint. Shandian looked once over her shoulder and let her eyes tell him what her mouth didn't dare. Don't run, learn to stand, the night will be long, I will be in it. Coulter watched her walk away, watched the elders fall around her like a small army that knew exactly which hill to die on and which to keep, watched Sheriff Milner rub the paper in his pocket like it could scratch a match. He felt the world narrow to a trail only one boot wide. A twig popped behind him. Coulter turned and found a shadow detached from the juniper. It resolved into a man with a hat pulled low and a grin that had never once been earned. Ezra Pike. He held something easy in his left hand, hidden under his coat line. His right hand was empty. Evening, Vale, he said, voice soft, almost companionable. Hell of a show you put on. The part where you didn't die was less to my taste. Coulter's shoulders squared without lifting. You set a fire in a dry ear. That's not ranching. That's cowardice. Ezra smiled wider. Oh, son. You think that was my hand? He flicked his chin toward the ridge. 3 more shadows unstuck themselves from the night. I just make sure the wind is right. Coulter didn't look away from Ezra to count the men. He counted the breath between Ezra's words and the way the man's jaw twitched when he lied and the edge in his own pulse that told him fear and readiness share a door. Walk with me, Ezra said, as if they were old friends heading to a game of cards. Let's go have a conversation about choices. Coulter didn't move. Ezra's smile fell off his face like bark. A small, precise click sounded from under his coat. It could have been a pocket watch. It could have been something that makes time stop. From the ridge behind Coulter, a fourth voice, oily, overfamiliar, floated down like a burr stuck to good wool. We can talk, it said. But only after Vale learns how to kneel. Coulter knew that voice. Every hair along his neck stood up. He turned just enough to see the speaker's face. The night cracked open with a cocked hammer. Hammer. The sound hung in the juniper dark like a held breath that wouldn't be released until someone paid for it. Coulter Vale didn't turn all the way, he shifted just enough to see who owned the click he'd heard and the voice he dreaded. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Ezra Pike stepped 1 pace closer, hat brim cutting his grin in half. 3 more shapes sloughed off the ridge and became men when they took on edges, boots, belts, the heavy set of hands that had done harm for wages. The 4th voice came last, lazy as spilled oil. On your knees, Vale, Slade Greeley said, easing a short-barreled revolver to rest where a man's ribs become promises. Let's talk eye level. Coulter didn't kneel. He put his weight into the ground the way you do when a horse wants to shy and you refuse to teach it that trick. You set fire to a dry bench. Wind did, Ezra said mildly. I don't own wind. You try to when it suits you. Slade's smile had no weather in it at all. Down. The hammer clicked again, not louder, closer. Coulter could smell powder and the citrus tang of oiled steel. Fire a shot, Coulter said, and Yazzie Nez will be here before the echo dies. Every dog in the basin will speak your names. Not if we have our talk where echoes go to sleep, Slade said, cocking his head toward the black cut of the old shearing shed. Walk. Coulter calculated the distances: juniper to wash, wash to shed, shed to ridge, then measured something harder: how fear sits beside resolve and shares canteens. I walk, he said, and she stays water. He tipped his chin at the willow below. No more fire. No harrow. Ezra's eyes never quite held still. I'm not promising a religion where a business belongs. Then you're not a neighbor, Coulter answered. Business first, Slade drawled. Knees last. They pushed him without spectacle. Slade kept the gun close enough that Coulter could feel each word vibrate through the barrel when he spoke. Ezra hung back, hands in his coat, the shape under the fabric making time nervous. Shandy and Begay stood in the shadow of the hogan and tried to breathe the night like medicine. Old women say to do that when your bones begin to shake for reasons you can't name and for reasons you can. Tazba's hand pressed a warm jar into Shandian's palm, corn pollen and cedar. You cannot mend a man with fear. I'm not afraid, Shandian lied, and then took the lie back. I am. But I can still walk. You will not walk where your uncle told you not to, Tazba said, and managed to make that a blessing instead of a chain. You will walk toward the words you must carry. Ashki Banali waited by Yazie's small, precise fire with his boots clean and his hat too new to be the one he works in. His smile could have bought salt if salt didn't know better. For elders sat with Yazie in a half-circle that had room for truth and no room for display. Ashki rose when Shandian approached. He set down a cloth bundle, coffee, flour, a coil of bright cord, silver buttons nested in wool, a little cornmeal for the road between households. Gifts with the correct names. Gifts with other names folded inside. My aunt spoke long ago, Ashki said, voice smooth as polished bone. Our families. Our families bury their dead together and feed their children together, Yazie said. Promises are not fences. They are paths. Shandian chooses which one her feet remember. Ashki inclined his head toward Shandian and spoke past her to the room. I am steady, he said. Ditches straight, stock fat, winter hay in racks. He let the inventory sit. I can keep a household. Can you keep a place? Shandian asked before her uncle could. Her voice came out calmer than her blood felt. Can you keep water? Ashki's smile didn't crack, because it had been tempered for this. I can keep the sheriff from bringing paper when folks don't need paper. Yazie's gaze sharpened. Speak the second half you tucked under that one. Ashki looked at his boots for exactly the amount of time a man does when he's about to name a bargain he's already made. Ezra Pike's foreman and I understand each other. Men talk. Favors wait for the right chore. Slade Greeley is not a chore you want inside your house, Ruthie said from the doorway, hands black with ash and will. He'll sweep you clean of your good sense by spring. Ashki's mouth thinned. Neighbors are scarce in a dry year. Sometimes you pick the ones you can carry. Sometimes you sit down thirsty instead, Tomas said. And let your mouth teach your feet patience. Ashki shifted. I came to show I'm ready to put my back under her life. That's all. He looked at Shandian again like he was trying to teach his eyes a new language. I won't make your world smaller to make my pride larger. Shandian felt the jar in her palm heat as if the corn pollen inside remembered 100 mornings and had chosen sides. When I stand at our spring, she said, I don't think about pride. I think about which faces water will remember drinking there when I am old. She drew breath the way you do before a song, not a fight. If I choose, I will choose a man who makes that list longer. Yazie didn't smile. He did allow the fire to throw a little more light on his niece's face. Ashki's jaw clenched, small and quick and real. And if I keep the sheriff home and the harrow parked? He held her with the word we. We could hold it together. You just said you'd do it by borrowing Ezra's shadow, Ruthie said. Shadows don't keep water. They just make it look cooler for a minute. Enough, Yazie said, because mercy should be given to the proud while it can still change them. He turned to Ashki. You will eat. You will sleep by our fire. You will be welcome in the morning. You will listen all night to the girl you want breathing beside your choices. Ashki gave a short nod that could have been respect or surrender. Sometimes they are the same shape. The shearing shed remembered lanolin and laughter and the way voices echo when men pretend they're not tired. Tonight it learned how a small wound can make the whole world feel like it's leaning downhill. Slade shoved Coulter onto a three-legged stool like he was setting a pail where it couldn't spill. On your knees was a nice opening offer, he said conversationally, but I'm not an artist. I do plain work with plain tools. Your word will do, Ezra said from the corner. He hadn't removed his hand from inside his coat. The shape there had grown more definite, a box or a block, not iron, something that could make a quiet place loud in a hurry. He says he ain't going to that spring again without my say-so, and we wrap this up with a ribbon. Coulter sat with his hands loosely braced on his thighs and wished he'd learned, earlier in life, what he knew now, that sometimes stubborn is just a man trying to make his fear feel useful. He made his fear useful anyway. A spring's not a gate, Ezra. You don't get a key. Slade's fist was the most honest thing in the shed. It landed once, twice, a simple punctuation. Coulter tasted copper and heat and the memory of a colt he'd gentled by holding still long enough for the animal to teach him something about itself. Say it, Ezra murmured. Tell me you'll call your cooperative children home. Tell me you'll keep Yazzie off that rim. Coulter looked at the dirt floor and saw 100 heel marks pointing in 100 different directions. If you want him off the rim, he said, voice rough, tell the wind to quit. Tell fire to stay dumb. Tell your men to stop mistaking water for weakness. Slade's mouth flattened. He's got words. Let's see if he's got air left to carry them. He reached for the idea he liked, making pain into a leash, and was interrupted by the stupidest noise a man can make at work, a laugh that isn't his. Leave him breathing, Ezra snapped, never taking his hand off the square shape under his coat. Dead men don't do chores. What's the box? Coulter asked, because naming a thing makes it change shape in the room. Ezra's grin came back. Something Sheriff Milner would like to keep out of his reports. He patted the outline. One stick of persuasion for roots and stubborn people. A little bang where a shovel does too much talking. Coulter's guts went cold. You light that near water that remembers and you'll turn the whole basin against you for 20 years. Ezra shrugged. 20 years is a long time to be rich. Coulter looked past Ezra to the far wall, where the moon pushed silver through a crack between planks. He thought of Shandian's face under smoke light and how her mouth had steadied when she said stay. He thought of Yazzie's eyes when he said come to my fire with your pride set down. He thought of Tazba's weaving and how a missed thread can teach the whole rug a hard lesson about pattern and repair. Let me up, he said. I won't run. Slade laughed. If I believe that about any man, it wouldn't be you. Coulter kept his hands where they could be seen and spoke to Ezra. You don't want your men to see you choose the kind of coward that needs a kneeling audience. Ezra's pride hurt itself and stood up. Let him stand, he told Slade, as if the idea had been his all along. Coulter rose. The room tilted and settled. Slade's gun tracked his breath. Ezra's hand never left the box. You want me to say the words, Coulter said. You want me to give you a story you can tell yourself at dawn when you take iron to water again. Here's a better one. He met Slade's eyes first because sometimes the leash is not in the master's hand. Walk me to the ridge. We'll stand where the spring can hear. I'll tell the water and the land in my own shame that I didn't do enough. If that satisfies you, you'll still be men by morning. Slade snorted. He wants witnesses. Water is the only witness that matters out here, Coulter said. Ezra thought fast, which was the problem with men like him. Fine, he said, easy as false rain. Let's give the spring a bedtime story. Yazzie Nez moved like shadow at the edge of his own fire. The men with him had quieted in the way warriors quiet when the work they prefer, clean lines, visible enemies, refuses to show itself and sends smoke instead. He found Shandian by the loom's doorway, Tazba's shawl around her shoulders and the jar of pollen near her heart. I told you not to go to him, Yazzie said without accusation. I didn't, she answered. I made my mouth learn how to say what it wanted without needing his eyes on it. Yazzie nodded once. Good. Now I need your feet. She straightened without thinking. Where? Along the seep, Yazzie said. Ruthie's taking 4. Tomas will keep the sheriff honest. I'll meet Ezra if he tries papers again. You will take the women who don't scare when men raise their voices and show them where the willow roots were hottest. You'll teach them to feel heat in the ground with their palms. Why me? Because you listen with your hands, Yazzie said. And because the spring listens to you back. Shandy and Sphere and Courage traded places again, and both of them agreed to keep walking. They were halfway to the seep when a horseman's shape cut across moonlight, a single rider, fast, alone, mouth wide with a message it couldn't carry fast enough. Ruthie! Eli shouted, sliding from the saddle before it had stopped. Shed, old one, men. Veil with them. He dragged air into his chest and forced the rest out. Box and Ezra's coat. Ruthie didn't ask how Eli knew. The land doesn't like a man who wastes questions when answers are already running. Tomas, she snapped, take 2 and wake the sheriff's feet. Shandian, with me. Shandian ran without learning how she decided. The jar thumped once against her ribs and then lay still as if even medicine knew when to hold its tongue. They reached the ridge just as Ezra, Slade, and 2 men pushed Coulter into moonlight. The willow whispered down below, still wet around its belly, still alive because people had taught themselves not to quit before dawn. Stop, Ruthie said, and her voice was a pry bar set against the scene. Turn around slow. Ezra did, easy smile already loaded for strangers. Evening. Don't evening me, Ruthie said. You going to pull that box out and show us all how small you are? Slade's gun slid toward her. Hush. Yazzie emerged from the wash like someone the ground had decided to return. Men make choices. Land keeps score. You brought a tool into a place where men use hands, he said to Ezra. That's a second mistake in one day. Ezra's eyes flicked left, right, counting. Sheriff coming? He's listening to his paper breathe, Tomas answered, stepping in at Ruthie's shoulder. He'll be here when he's done with that fool chore. Then we'll be gone by the time the ink dries, Ezra said, shifting his coat. Show it, Ruthie said. Let us call it by its name. Ezra let the grin widen and drew the box like a magician showing you his trick's end instead of the good part. Pine, smooth, wired. A friction cap tucked into a corner like a bad idea waiting for a bored man. Yazzie didn't move. Put it down. Step back. Slade moved instead. His gun found Coulter's ribs again like it had enjoyed the feel and wanted more. Trade, Slade said. We walk, he breathes. Shandian had been watching the ground, not the men. Land tells the truth while people practice. The soil beneath Ezra's boots had a new story written on it, boot tracks in a pattern she didn't like. Heavy prints in and out. A scuff where someone had crouched. A faint white dusting near a crack in the limestone above the seep. She stepped sideways for a better line on the white. Lime. Or tailings. Or. Her stomach dropped. She had seen this once as a child when men blasted a cattle guard into a track east of the post. The powder drift when they split the bag and fed it into a hole. Stop, she said, sharper than she meant. Nobody move. Ezra's smile grew curious. Why, sweetheart? Shandian pointed at the crack. There. Tomas swore softly. He primed a hole. Ezra's pride preened. A little insurance. Nothing the law needs to bother over if neighbors behave. Yazzie took one long step that stopped an inch before wisdom said it should. What else? Ezra tapped the friction cap like it was his wife's shoulder. Fuse. Not lit. Slade's jaw worked. He didn't like his boss talking too much in rooms where people could do math. Trade, he said again, harder. We walk. The boy lives. Nobody crawls into any holes and gets themselves remembered wrong. Coulter found Shandian's eyes and let his face say what his mouth couldn't with a barrel on it. Don't follow me if I run. Don't run if I tell you to. He had learned, in a shed where lanolin used to sweeten the air, that a man's chest can hold both patterns at once. Ruthie moved her pry bar half an inch. We're not trading breath for blackmail. Then we're lighting education, Ezra said lightly, and reached for the cap. Yazzy's hand shot out, faster than a story can memorize itself. He didn't grab Ezra. He grabbed the box. It flew, a square bird with bad wings, and hit the ground on its edge. The cap skittered. The wire sang. Everyone stopped being an idea and became hands. Tomas went for Ezra's wrist. Ruthie went for Slade's gun. Yazzie went for the wire. Shandian went to her knees. She found the crack with her fingers and felt the tremble of a whole board where no hole belonged. Fine dust clung to her skin like it remembered something hotter it wanted to be. She reached in and felt fuse, twine-coated, stiff, snaking down where the limestone throat went narrow. Careful, Ruthie breathed. If there's a blasting cap seated. I know, Shandian said, and men I think I know, and men I have to know now or we'll all learn a different lesson. Over her shoulder, men grunted like cattle pushing through a gate that had waited too long to be opened. Ezra's wrist cracked under Tomas's grip and then slid like an eel. Slade's gun fired once, into the ground, dirt leaping, darkness taking the sound and tearing it in half. Yazzie dragged the wire back and found slack where there shouldn't have been any slack if Ezra had prepared the thing to go dumbly, meaning Ezra had prepared it clever, meaning the slack was in the wrong place on purpose. Slade. Ezra barked. Get her out of there. Slade lunged. Ruthie put her pry bar where Ishin thought it was safe to be. Slade folded, hit the ground, rolled with a cat's meanness, and came up with a knife as if steel could change the shape of a mistake. Coulter moved then. Everything from the shed to this second had been the country teaching him to wait. The country gave him back the moment with interest. He pivoted into Slade, shoulder to sternum, elbow to wrist, the knife clattering. The gun swung toward his face and he batted it with the edge of his hat the way he'd once redirected a Bronx panic into the notion of standing still. The shot went past his ear and hit a rock that still had the moon on it. Shandian tugged the fuse and felt where it stuck. It's wedged on a shelf, she said, voice steady because her grandmother had taught her that hands will listen if you make your mouth sound like you believe in them. I can't pull. I have to go in. No, Yazzie said without heat, and meant it. Yes, Shandian said without apology, and meant it. She slid her arm deeper into the limestone throat until the rock scraped the inside of her elbow and her shoulder protested and the taste of old water climbed up her sinuses. Her fingers found the shelf and the little hard nub that had turned fuse into certainty. Blasting cap. She swallowed until her ears popped. I've got it, she whispered, because louder would make the world listen too hard and flinch. Don't pull it free, Ruthie said, breath close, calm shoring up calm. Twist. Slow. If it's crimped badly, you want to unmake the crimp a hair before you try to choose your next life. Shandian twisted. The cap turned in the dark where a stone throat meets old stubborn. It held. She twisted again, smaller. The cap gave a fraction, the way a man does when he's about to learn something the hard way and decides at the last second to learn it easier. Behind her, Slade's forearm found Coulter's throat and clamped. Ezra's hand found the wire again like a moth finds its particular candle. Yazzie's fist found Ezra's temple. Tomas found his breath and used it to say the sheriff's name so loud the man would have to pick up his feet. The cap loosened. Shandian began to draw it out slow, slow, slow. Ezra, dazed, did the one clever thing left to a man who's lost the room. He put the cap back in his pocket with one hand and used the other to strike a match on the heel of his boot and touch it to the free end of fuse he'd tucked into his coat for just such a sermon. The fuse hissed like a snake that knows your ankles by name. Shandian felt it through the limestone before anyone saw it, the vibration of intention headed toward her hand. Move! Ruthie shouted. I can't, Shandian said. If I pull fast I'll seat the cap wrong in. Give it, Ruthie said, and set her palm on Shandian's forearm. I'll hold the world steady. You do the part only you can do. Shandian closed her fingers around the cap as if it were a robin's egg in her childhood both. She turned once more. The metal sighed in the dark like it had decided it could be something gentler than it had been made for. It came free. The hiss reached the crack's mouth. The tip of fuse glowed like a coal that had found a story to climb into. Shandian did the only wrong thing that could be right fast enough. She bit the burning end. Heat kissed her teeth. Pain rang her skull. The hiss cut itself in half and then in quarters and then into silence that had to learn how to be silence again. She spat black thread and the taste of 100 men's stupid choices into her palm and realized her hands were shaking hard enough to rattle old ghosts out of the limestone. What did you? Coulter started, choking on Slade's arm and his own fear all at once. She stopped being polite, Ruthie said, awe and fury braided. Good girl. Ezra made a sound that wasn't language and tried to run. Yazzy's hand closed on the back of his coat like a father stopping a child from walking into a road. Slade thrashed and earned himself a rock from Tomas that taught him about the value of not thrashing. Sheriff Milner arrived with his gun out and his paper in his pocket and his face so white it might have glowed without the moon's help. He took in the cap in Shandian's palm, the fuse blackened and chewed, the wire, the box, the men, the way the willow's leaves were still wet with a kind of borrowed mercy, and holstered his gun slowly so no one would think he didn't know what it was for anymore. Arrests, he said hoarsely, and then found the law inside his chest instead of in his pocket. Now. They walked Ezra Pike into town at a pace that respected dignity without feeding it. 2 of his riders melted away into the juniper and discovered, to their shock, that the country they'd used for practicing intimidation did not offer them shortcuts when it was time to run home. Tomas locked Ezra and Slade in the little 2-cell jail with the air of a man who had waited a decade to put precisely these names in precisely these places. Sheriff Milner wrote down words like attempted endangerment and arson and possession of blasting agents and then crossed out the words and wrote them again because he wanted to feel the ink bite twice. Yazzie sent men to sit in front of the jail with coffee and eyes that didn't blink. Ruthie took the cap and the fuse in the box and laid them on a table in the post like a science lesson for any boy who thought mischief was a color he could wear without it soaking through. Shandian washed her hands and mouth in a pan where the water turned gray and then black and then, after 3 changes, found its clear again. Tazba dabbed juniper tea on her lip and told her in the same breath to be braver and to be less brave and to sit still long enough to hear which part of herself wanted the other to win. Coulter sat on the stoop, elbows on knees, head down. The night's quiet pressed against him like the weight of a dog that finally trusts you enough to go to sleep on your boots. He hadn't noticed he was crying until his tears found ash and made tiny rivers on his cheeks. Shandian touched his shoulder. He looked up and tried to stand and failed and laughed at himself for failing, which was better medicine than any apology he could have invented. You bit a live fuse, he said, voice full of something he wouldn't later be able to name without crying again. Don't do that twice. I won't, she said, and believed it and didn't, both. Your uncle is going to kill me, he added, and half meant it. He invited you to live, she said. That's harder work. Ashki Banali stood at the edge of the lamplight with his hat in his hands. He had not run. He had not helped. He had watched as men sometimes do when the thing happening asks them to become larger in a way that shows all the places they were small. He came forward now and put his gifts back in his arms one by one. This isn't the day to ask a girl for a path, he said roughly. I'll come when my hands can say more than my mouth. He looked at Coulter and did not try to hide his resentment or his respect. Earn her. Or I will. He walked away into a night that would scratch him honest or spit him back out the same. Yazzie took his place on the stoop beside Coulter and let silence do a minute of work before he spoke. She bit a fuse. She kept a spring, Coulter said. Yazzie grunted. Don't love her because she is brave, he said. Love her because she is careful with what the world gives her to keep. He stood. And get some sleep. Sheriff says Judge will ride from Holbrook tomorrow. Ezra will talk before sunrise if he understands the kind of men sitting outside his door. Coulter nodded and didn't sleep. Dawn put a thin coin of light on the mesa and slid it down into the basin. The willow glimmered where water touched it and the new earth round the roots held like a stitched wound. Shandian and Ruthie walked the rim in boots damp from grass. They counted boot prints that didn't belong to this morning. They followed a pair that broke from the others and took a track cunning men think is cunning because it's obvious. They found a binder twine snagged on Cholla and a cigarette but ground into dirt with the IQ of a man who thinks dust is a good broom. Slade's, Ruthie said. He smokes like he's trying to be seen by the moon. They dropped into a draw that led toward a cattle tank and surprised a hawk who had been shopping for mice. The hawk scolded them for coming late to the market and flew off with its own inventory. Shandian crouched at the tank and looked at the water, green as money, scummed at the edge where cows tell the land what they've eaten. On the far side, a culvert emptied into the tank from the mesa. Someone had left the culvert's grate unbolted. Someone had poured a string of white pebbles along the lip. Not pebbles. Pellets. Ruthie swore again, without heat. Quicklime, she said. Cheap as poor choices. Shandian's breath came short. He meant to poison the seep if the blast failed. Ruthie's jaw went hard. Or while we were at the jail congratulating ourselves on earning a judge. She planted her pry bar and levered the culvert gate open with one easy motion. Get me sacks. Clay. Anything. We're sandbagging this where even wind can't play tricks. Shandian ran. In town, Sheriff Milner stood in front of Ezra's cell with his hat off and his hair trying to make him look younger than his choices had managed. You can make this easier on yourself, he told Ezra. Judge'll be here by noon. Ezra leaned his head against the bars and smiled like a man who had decided the day's already over and nothing you can tell him will change that. You don't know what you've pulled loose. Pulled you, Milner said. Off a spring. Ezra's grin widened until it showed some of the boy he used to be when cruelty was still an experiment. Pulled my finger out of a dam you don't know the size of. I've got partners, Sheriff. Men with paper that talks louder than a whole chapter house. You think Holbrook matters? The judge can stamp until his arm falls off. You'll need a federal hand to hold me down. Milner swallowed because men who wear badges feel two kinds of fear, the kind with guns and the kind with ink. You'll still be here when he rides in. We'll see, Ezra said pleasantly, and lay down on the wooden bench like a man prepared to be fetched by his own future. Slade Greeley spat into his corner and caught the sheriff's eye with a look that had broken other men's nerve in darker rooms. It skittered off Milner, who had been broken by better men and put back together cheaper. Judge won't matter, Slade said. Night will. Not this one, Milner said. You'll spend it under my roof. Slade grinned like a coyote who has learned the shape of chicken wire. Who says the roof stays? Milner felt cold. Real, not law, move along his scalp. Shandian and Ruthie stacked sandbags across the culvert's throat until the draw looked like a wartime photograph. Yazzie set two men above the grate with rifles and the patience you use when you're teaching a boy to rope without cutting off his thumbs. Tomas rode to the trading post to borrow more sacks and came back with 6 and a story about a wagon spotted near the far arroyo, tarps riding low like gilt. Coulter hadn't slept, but his movements were clean anyway. When he lifted sacks, he did it without making the women around him feel like he owned the work. When he set them, he did it with a carpenter's eye and a sheepherder's care. When he spoke, he kept it measured, as if he'd decided not to spend more words than the day would pay back. By mid-morning, the culvert wore a new mouth and the willow wore new shade where men had strung canvas to teach the sun manners. The basin exhaled. Shandian drank from the seep with her hands and sent a quiet thanks in the way you do when you don't want to show off your prayer. She stood and found Ashki across the water, hands in his pockets, hat on the ground, looking like a man who'd slept less than Coulter and had learned fewer useful lessons during that time. I went to the jail, he said without greeting. I watched Ezra smile. I don't like it when a man in a cell smiles. Men who think they own paper smile at bars, Shandian said. It's a habit they practice until it looks like confidence. Ashki rubbed his jaw. I don't want to borrow Ezra's shadow anymore. He said it as if he were breaking up with a woman he'd only dated in his head. He looked at Coulter over her shoulder. I still don't like that you're here. Coulter shrugged. I don't like that I'm here either when I think about the shed. But I'm standing anyway. I nodded, once, without handing over any more dignity than he could spare. I brought the judge water when he rode in, he added, almost apologetic. He was dust white. He thanked me like he meant it. Good, Shandian said. Make a habit of that. The judge was younger than his job and older than his horse. He wore the face of a man who has failed enough times to know what success actually costs. He listened to Sheriff Milner and to Tomas and to Ruthie and to Yazzie. He asked Ezra a question. He listened wrong on purpose to see what a liar's first story sounds like when he thinks you're stupid. Then he said the thing the basin needed, the spring is held in common. You don't cut common things without the longest talk. He put his stamp on paper like a man who had remembered which tools are worth being proud of. Injunction through hearing. Ezra didn't flinch. I'll bring my men in suits, he said, pleasant as ever. They'll talk longer. Good, the judge said. Bring lunch. Slade grinned his new grin, the one he was practicing for nights that don't belong to law. Sun goes down, he said, almost musical. Roof might go with it. The judge looked at him the way a hawk looks at a snake that hasn't learned it's not the top thing in the sky. Then I'll watch it go down from the porch of the jail, he said. I'm staying. Ezra's smile cracked. A sliver of the boy he had stomped out of himself tried to get up and look around. He kicked it back down with his heel and asked to speak to his counsel. He didn't have one. He named a man in town. The judge sent a runner. The runner returned with a shake of his head and a message that smelled like a door closing, counsel at a funeral. Back tomorrow. Then we see you tomorrow, the judge said. And tonight, we sleep in the same building as the men who promised to stay under its roof. He said we in the basin forgot, for a moment, how tired it was. Evening came like a horse you didn't entirely trust, decent temperament, bad past. Men and women ate stew in bowls that tasted of smoke. Children fell asleep under benches because the adults kept talking where they could see each other's faces, and this made the night less likely to play tricks. Ruthie sat with Shandian on the jail steps, both of them with blankets over their knees and nothing over their courage. Coulter leaned against a post across the street and did not let his eyes rest where they wanted. Yazzie walked slow circles, the way men walk when they have to show patience to their anger again and again until anger lies down and breathes like any other animal. Sheriff Milner and the judge played cribbage on a box that used to hold ammunition. Tomas beat a rhythm on the porch rail with two fingers that sounded like a warning and like comfort depending on what your day had taught you to hear. A mule screamed down the alley like it had been taught a new joke it didn't want. Ruthie stood. Shandian did too without knowing she decided. The roof lifted. It didn't explode. It rose as if the jail had taken a breath of bad air and was trying to cough it out. Sound came a heartbeat later, timbers groaning, nails crying, a hard thud where a support remembered gravity too late. Back, the judge shouted, and people moved because they trusted the man whose stamp had saved their morning and whose chair had saved his own back. The roof didn't fall. It tilted and stopped, held by something inside. Yazzie swore for the first time that day. They cut the uprights. Wedged it with a jack. Who? Milner demanded, already knowing. Men who know how loud we hear gunfire and how quiet we ignore creaking until it becomes a sermon, Tomas said grimly. A match flared in the alley, small, dumb, brave in the wrong direction. Flames lit the back wall where someone had poured oil like a man types a threat in a letter he doesn't sign. Ruthie moved with her pry bar in a bucket line formed from habit that turned to muscle memory that turned to grace. Water slapped hot wood and read the fire a bedtime story it didn't like. Shandian felt her feet move before she had her thought. She slipped along the side of the jail, eyes on the roof where it had shifted, listening for the small sounds that tell a person when something heavy is pretending to be patient. Inside the cell, Ezra laughed. Basin folk. Come see what happens when your judge naps on a powder keg of goodwill. Shut up, Slade said, not kindly, and then, to everyone else, without moving his mouth, listen. Shandian pressed her palm to the wall and heard it, a second jack, somewhere inside, slowly losing teeth. Under, she screamed, and dove as the roof finally chose a direction. It came down with the sound a tree makes when a man who doesn't love it cuts it anyway. Splinters flew like a flock of mean birds. The front beam dropped across the cell door and jammed it shut. The wall buckled. The alley fire shrieked and ate the oil it had been given and asked for more. Yazzie was already there, hands on the beam. Coulter was at his shoulder a blink later. Ruthie wedged the pry bar under the timber and leaned until her boots creaked. The judge threw his weight in without giving a speech about precedent. Back wall. Tomas yelled. Get that flame. Water hit oil. Steam punched the night. Smoke tasted like Ezra Pike's grin. Shandian crawled to the barred window and peered in. Ezra stood with his back to the far wall, eyes bright with the kind of joy some men only feel when other people are burning. Slade was at the bars, face pale under soot, not for fear. This was not a man who frightened well, but with calculation. He met Shandian's gaze and something flickered there she had not expected to see, not remorse, respect for the thing in her that had bit a fuse. Move, she told him. We'll get the door. You'll get the door, Slade repeated, and then said a quiet thing so only she could hear it. Check the beam's notch. She blinked. What? Now, he said, and stepped back. Shandian slid along the wall to the door where Yazzie and Coulter and the judge were straining against the beam. She dropped to her knees and ran her fingers along the timber's underside and found it, a wedge set by a patient bastard. You could lift all night and the door would never clear unless you kicked the wedge first. There, she said, and Yazzie didn't ask how she knew. He kicked. The wedge spat out like a bad tooth. The beam shifted a handspan. The door gave a cry and then a groan and then an inch. Again, the judge gasped. They lifted. The wedge was gone. The beam climbed. The door opened. Sheriff Milner dragged Ezra out and put him on his face in the dirt with handcuffs that clicked like a hand closing. Another deputy, young, new, mouth hard with a lesson he hadn't asked to learn, hauled Slade and almost fell with surprise when Slade didn't fight. Who cut the uprights? The judge demanded over the roar of water and fire and men who had remembered they were heavier together. No one from town, Tomas said grimly, catching his breath. Quarry men from the interstate. Ezra doesn't run out of neighbors when he's paying cash. Ezra laughed into the dirt. Tomorrow, he said, spitting mud. You'll run out of rope before I run out of days. Shandian stood in the churn of smoke and light and men's breath and felt the basin's heartbeat in her ribs. It was fast. It was not frightened. It was ready. Then a sound came from the ridgeline that changed the shape of the night again, a horn, low and long, the one Yazzie's men used when talk had ended and other kinds of language needed to begin. Yazzie's head snapped up. Ridge. Ruthie swore softly. Cattle. Tomas didn't swear. He listened once more to the horn and heard what Ruthie had, not just cattle. A drove pushed hard and mean toward the trading post, toward the jail, toward the line of people holding buckets. Who's pushing? The judge asked. Coulter's face went still in a way Shandian had learned meant he was counting distances and griefs. Men who want us to choose which thing to save. The horn sounded again, closer, and the ground began to talk in hooves. Shandian reached for Coulter's hand without deciding to, and he gave it, and Yazzie lifted his rifle, and Ezra Pike laughed into the dirt like a man who'd brought his choir to sing. The first heads broke the ridge, eyes white, foam hanging, 100 bodies behind them gathering speed for the wrong kind of lesson. Hold the line. Ruthie shouted. Split left. Tomas yelled. Up. Yazzie barked, rifle level. Coulter squeezed Shandian's fingers once, a vow with no words, and let go. The herd thundered down. And the fuse of the night, the one none of them saw lit, hissed toward the base of the trading post where someone had tucked it under the porch like a snake. Shandian saw it first. She opened her mouth to shout and the world took a breath in. The porch caught light. Not a roar, an inhale, a thin orange tongue licking the underside of the trading post like it meant to learn the taste of dry pine before speaking in sentences. Shandy and Begay's mouth moved before her mind could offer choices. Fuse, she yelled, and the word turned heads the way thunder turns cattle. She hit the porch on her knees, hands scrabbling at shadow, splinters needling her palms. The hiss told her where to look, a black snaking line tucked against the sill, spark racing like gossip. Water! Tomas shouted behind her. Don't splash, smother, Ruthie barked, already moving. Shandian dragged the fuse into moonlight. It bit back, ember nipping her knuckles, the hot stink of burning jute sliding up her nose. She didn't bite it this time, her teeth still hummed from the too-close lesson by the seep. She slapped it with a wet flour sack Tomas shoved into her hands, then another, then a third until the hiss guttered into a mean little sigh. Second run! Ruthie cried, and Shandian saw it, the twin line tucked farther back, nailed to the joist with a neat little staple a patient hand had set in daylight. She went flat, shoulders scraping, reached deep. Boards pressed her spine. Her fingers found the line, found the heat, found the exact wrong place to be a human being and the exact right place to be herself. A mouse flashed past her cheek with the outrage only small things can manage. Got you, she whispered, and pinched, feeling the ember die between her fingers like a lie that wanted to live. When she backed out, the night had changed shape. The herd came like weather. Down off the ridge, white-eyed, foam at their mouths, 100 head and more, the sound not so much hooves as a decision the ground had made. Yazzie Nez stepped forward into it with his rifle down, because rifles read wrong to cattle. He threw his voice the way he threw a rope, low, sure, patient, mean when it needed encouragement. Hup! Hey! Hup! Caltervale didn't think, he remembered. He grabbed a tarp from a wagon bed and sprinted left, shouting, flapping, then dropping the cloth exactly where the lead cow could see it and decide to dislike it. 2 boys, Eli and a kid too new to have a name that stuck, rattled tin pans. Tomas split right with 3 men and a length of chain, throwing a noise that had shape to it. The lead cow checked. It is a holy thing when panic checks. She threw her head and went sideways, not much, just half a doorway, but the mass behind her listened. A line that had been pointed at people and would turn toward the alley that opened onto the pig corral. Ruthie planted her pry bar, made herself big enough to be a wall. The judge climbed onto a rain barrel and waved his coat like a matador who wanted forgiveness instead of applause. Gate! Yazzie shouted. Ashki Benali, who had run toward the noise with his hat off and his teeth clenched like he meant to bite the trouble before it bit him, hit the pig pen latch and swung it wide. He whistled, a clean, sharp country sound, and the first dozen steers poured through like water choosing a new arroyo. Others bunched, battered each other, shoved at nothing and at everything. Wooden slats cracked. Nails remembered they were metal and complained. Easy! Calter yelled, palms up, voice pitched to the note herd animals here is God instead of wolf. He stepped into the bubble in front of the second lead and held it, 3 feet of space and a whole life's worth of consequences. Easy, girl. Easy. She blinked. Panic leaked out of her like rain through cheatgrass. The line bent. The street became a river and the river took the path that didn't end in people. 20 head. 30. 50. Suddenly the worst of the night was a kind of thunder that wasn't hungry anymore. Behind the herd, 3 riders showed the shape of the men who'd pushed them. They hauled up fast when they saw the jail lit, the roof cockeyed, the judge on a barrel, Yazzie on foot with a rifle he hadn't had to raise. One rider tried to lift his horse into a turn and found Tomas's chain in the angle he'd meant to use. He swore in a language that had more spit than grammar and lit out for the northern arroyo with his hat trying to leave him. The other 2 followed because men who will stampede cattle seldom stay to explain themselves when the stampede fails. The herd packed into the pig corral until the fence bowed and hummed and held. Eli slammed the gate. The judge dropped off the barrel and almost fell, then laughed at himself, which bought him a pound of credit with every man and woman watching. Report, he said, voice hoarse, hands on his knees. Fire out, Ruthie snapped. Roof braced. Prisoners secured. She threw a look at Sheriff Milner that said, "This time in a way that will keep." Milner nodded, cheeks gray but eyes steady. "We hold." Shandian's hands shook. She clenched and unclenched them until the world got the message. Her lips still burned from the first fuse. The flour sack had left a damp print on her forearm in the shape of a sideways map of the basin. Coulter turned and found her and checked her with his eyes the way a man checks a horse after a bad bog: ears, breath, stance. "You good?" She nodded, then shook her head, then laughed once, because the body has its own grammar. "I will be." He heard the truth of it and let himself believe it. Ezra Pike, face down in the dirt with his wrists cuffed, rolled his head so he could see the corral. He smiled a small, private smile, the kind men wear when they can't decide whether to be impressed or afraid. "You built a good night," he murmured, more to the ground than to anyone who deserved to hear him. "No," Yazzie said, standing over him, voice almost gentle. "We remembered one. Dawn made a clean promise and kept it this time." The willow at water that remembers trembled in a breeze that smelled like cooled ash and coffee and tired people learning to be lighter without forgetting what they'd carried. The judge wrote. Sheriff Milner swore men in, real deputies with eyes that had seen enough to be useful. Ruthie inventoried evidence with the same practicality she used on a barn aisle: cap, wire, box, fuse, wedge, photographs taken with Tomas's old bellows camera, notations that would make paper heavier than Ezra's money for once. Word from Holbrook came with dust on its boots and steel in its verbs: U.S. Marshal writing tomorrow with a federal injunction wrapped around water rights like a blanket with too many hands on it. Chapter House called a special meeting. The cooperative stacked their tools in a line so neat even their enemies had to admit someone had thought beyond supper. Shandian slept 2 hours in a row and woke at a sound that had become part of her, a horse's hooves on rock, then the quiet that means the rider is someone you don't have to turn yourself into a wall for. Yazzie's silhouette filled the door. He held his hat in both hands like a man entering a room where women had already made the important decisions. "Your grandmother wants you," he said softly. Tazba sat by the loom with a clean white weft stretched across a pattern of stone lines and water lines and the diamond that reminds a mind of 4 directions. She didn't look up until Shandian knelt. "You were noisy," Tazba said, which in her language meant, you lived with all you had. "I was noisy," Shandian agreed. Tazba set down her comb and took Shandian's hands. The old woman's fingers smelled like sheep and cedar and a touch of juniper tea. "You asked a cowboy for a kiss." Shandian colored. "Yes. You asked because you wanted to know if your mouth could do what your feet do, carry you where you meant to go." Tazba's eyes were not unkind. "Did you learn anything?" Shandian let her breath go. "That a kiss can be a door and a promise. That my mouth can say yes without my fear needing to speak first." Tazba nodded and returned to her weaving. "Good. Then you will choose a life that matches your mouth." She flicked her gaze toward the door, where Coulter's shadow waited without pushing inward. A man who lands his weight where the ground can hold it. A man whose hands don't teach women to make themselves smaller. Shandian's chest hurt in a way that meant it was growing. "Do you bless it?" Tazba threaded a new strand. "I bless the parts of you that already knew how to stand. The rest will stand if you feed it." They met at the willow when the sun laid coins of light on each leaf as if paying back a debt. Coulter had shaved with a dull blade and regretted it. He had washed with cold water because that's what the basin offered, and he had decided he would be the kind of man who took what it offered and made himself better instead of bitter. Shandian came with her braid down her back and ash still in the weave at the end, because some things you don't wash out right away, you let them remind you to be respectfully proud. "I have something to say," she began, and he lifted a palm. "Me first," he said, then smiled, sheepish. "I mean, I need to say mine before I lose my nerve." She folded her arms to keep her hands from doing their own talking. "Say it." He swallowed. "I am not asking you to be the part of my life that makes me softer. I'm asking to be the part of yours that makes you stronger because you don't have to carry so much alone." He laughed quietly at himself. That sounded like something a man rehearses. I didn't. Last night I saw what you do when the world is on a hinge. I want to be there when it swings the right way. And when it swings wrong, I want to be the hinge you can put your weight on. Shandian stared at him the way you look at a ridge you thought you knew and realize has another canyon tucked behind it. You can't be my hinge, she said softly. But you can be my hand on the door when I decide to open it. He let out the breath he'd been keeping from the night before and didn't realize he had until it made him sway. I can do that. She stepped closer. Then ask me. He did, the old way and the new way at once, words and silence together. May I kiss you? Yes, she said. Because I choose it. He bent not like a man who thinks he's owed a thing, but like a man who puts down a bundle he's carried too carefully to drop. Their mouths met and learned what they'd been trying to say with work and water and bad nights handled well, that a kiss is not a prize but a practice. When they parted, he didn't step back. He stayed close in case she had anything else to teach with her eyes. I'm not the kind of woman who waits for men to make a place safe, she said, and he nodded, because the creak in his gut both had taught him that truth. I am the kind who believes a place can be made safer by the right kind of man standing in it. Then I'll stand, he said. She smiled. Stand with my uncle today. He wants you on the fence line. He wants to pretend he's testing you when he's actually learning how to trust you. I suspected. Coulter brushed a leaf from her braid. Do I have permission to tell him that? You have permission to laugh when he denies it. The U.S. Marshal arrived with dust on his boots and the look of a man who had learned to hate paperwork because of what it took him away from. He walked the seep. He touched the willow. He listened to Ruthie and the judge and Sheriff Milner and Yazzie. He spent longer listening to Tazba, who spoke the way old rivers navigate new gravel bars. When he finally looked at Ezra Pike through the bars of the cell, what he said wasn't theatrical. It was a sentence with clean nouns and heavy verbs. You're charged, he said. And you're going to Holbrook today. The big court after. Your suits can ride to meet you. Ezra smiled the way a man smiles when smiling is all he has left. I'll be back. The marshal shrugged as if the idea bored him. Maybe. Basin will be different either way. Slade Greeley stood in the other cell with his hands loose and his eyes watching the kind of careful a fox does before it decides whether to steal or starve. He caught Shandian's gaze the way he'd caught it by the collapsed door, but this time there was no wedge he could point her to and no advantage to bargain. He tipped his head a fraction. Thank you, she said, surprising herself. He blinked. For what? For telling me about the notch. His mouth went sideways. Didn't tell you. Told myself. You were listening. That's what we do here, she said. He looked at Ezra and then away, then back at her. If I talk, he said, you going to do something with it? She didn't look to the judge or the marshal or Yazzie. If you talk, we'll listen. If it's worth anything, it won't be thrown away. Slade nodded once, a man feeling the shape of a different road under his boots. There's a rancher over the border with powder in his salt bins. Ezra buys with his brother's name. There's a lawyer in Winslow who edits county minutes in pencil. There's a road crew that never finishes the part of the road that would make your spring less vulnerable. He lifted his eyes, met Shandian's. Ezra is the hat. You're holding the head. Names, the marshal said from the doorway. Slade gave them, spelling when he had to, getting some wrong in ways that showed he had only ever cared to hear them, not honor them. Be careful with a man who learns redemption like a trick, Tazba murmured later to Shandian. Sometimes they juggle what you hand them. I know, Shandian said. But sometimes a trick becomes a trade, and a trade becomes a practice, and a practice becomes a different man. Tazba grunted, which in her grammar meant, we will see. Afternoon brought a wind that cleaned edges without moving the heart of the heat. The cooperative men set posts in a new line that didn't box water. Yazzie rode with Coulter along the fence, showing him where wire makes sense and where it's just a way to cut your own leg when you fall. They talked in short sentences because horses understand men better when men don't try so hard. You were Ezra's once, Yazzie said finally. I was a version of myself that made Ezra possible, Coulter answered. I stopped being him. Yazzie considered the answer and let the horse pick a smarter path around Prickly Pear while he did. Don't ask my niece to build the rest of your becoming. I won't, Coulter said. I'll do that work and arrive at her door with it finished enough that she isn't tempted to pick up my tools. Yazzie snorted. She'll still pick them up. She's built that way. But I will watch to make sure you know how to use your own. Coulter smiled. I was afraid you might. Good, Yazzie said. Fear is a tool too. He tugged his hat down and spurred into a trot. Come on. There's a low spot where water likes to gather its thoughts and boys like you used to cut across because it looks like a shortcut. They rode. They fixed the place. Coulter learned it in his hands. The chapter house filled at sunset. Words went where they were asked. The judge sat in the back and kept his hat on the bench beside him like a man who knows he's a guest. Sheriff Milner listened with his notebook closed. The marshal didn't come. His job had left town with Ezra shackled to a chain that looked less like a chain when he put his hands on it. Shandian stood only once, because speeches were people thin. She said the names of people who had held lines: Ruthie, Tomas, Eli, the judge, the sheriff, the boys who rattled pans, the women who knew where water keeps its patience. She did not say her own name. Ruthie stood after and said it for her, which is how real names get put where they can do good. When the meeting ended, Tazba spoke last. The old woman didn't rehearse. She never had to. Water remembers, she said simply. Let it remember you as people who stood where you belonged. They walked out under a sky so full of stars it made the idea of fences look silly. Coulter found Shandian by the hitch rail. She was quiet in the way a person is when they've used up all their loud for the day and are hoping the night will give some back in small coins. Come up canyon tomorrow, he said. There's a place where the rock looks like a door someone made for a giant. I want to show you how the wind sounds there. You want to show me wind? She teased, tired and sweet at once. I want to hear it with you, he said. She squeezed his fingers. All right. Morning found them where he had promised, the rock door framing a piece of sky the color of enamel. The wind did, in fact, have a sound he hadn't known until she named it for him, low as a prayer, high as a kettle, both at once, neither greedy nor ashamed. They sat. They didn't talk. They let the place speak. After a while, she said, no one ever kissed me. She smiled at the joke she was telling on herself and on the title of a story someone would one day put on a shelf for strangers. Until you. He laughed. You were the one who made that true. I was, she said, not shy. And now I have something else to make true. She turned to him, took his face in her hands, and kissed him the way a person drinks after holding a line all night, grateful, steady, unashamed of need. When she was done, she put her forehead to his. Now it's true that I kissed someone. He closed his eyes. We can keep making truths. We can, she said. About water. About fences. About what men and women do with fear when they decide to be useful. And about doors, he added. How they open. And about staying, she said, and the words settled between them like a full bowl. He stayed. Weeks later, Ezra's men in suits arrived with papers that made us sound like money and certainty. The big court took them apart with questions the Basin had taught the judge to ask in smaller rooms. Slade talked enough to stitch a line from Ezra's pockets to men with pencils sharper than their ethics. He didn't lie very well. That helped. The federal injunction became a decree. Water that remembers was named as common, protected, not to be cut or poisoned or frightened into a new name. Sheriff Milner made it his hobby to like the feeling he got when he enforced that paper. The cooperative taught themselves to be boring in the way good structures are boring, posts straight, ledger neat, arguments solved before the sun went down. Ashki Benali kept his gifts this time. He used the bright cord to repair a harness. He traded the silver buttons for a sack of seed to a woman who made bread you could smell from the road. He brought those loaves to Shandian one morning and shook Coulter's hand like it hadn't been hard for him to make his fingers do it. "Paths," he said, half a smile. "We picked them." "We can trade stories along the fence," Coulter answered. "That's how neighbors keep from getting lost." Ashki nodded. "And if you turn stupid, I'll take my hat off and remind you who taught me how to be better." "I hope you do," Coulter said, and meant it. Slade went south when the court finished with him. He didn't say goodbye. Men like him change addresses, not hearts, but sometimes the letters catch up. Months later, a postcard came from a town whose only claim was a windmill that never stopped squeaking. No return name. Just a line, "Don't let the boy near the salt bins sell you lime." The handwriting looked like a man trying to make his own choices legible. Ruthie hung the card over the post office desk with a pen and a snort. "Trick turn practice," she said to no one in particular. "We'll see." On a morning without dust, Shandian and Coulter stood together at Water That Remembers while Tazba spoke words over them that were less blessing and more instruction. Yazzie Nez stood beside Coulter and made his face stern on purpose so his eyes could be soft for free. The judge and the marshal and Sheriff Milner came with the right kind of hats and the right kind of hands, empty. Ruthie brought a coil of rope and laid it on the ground like a circle you step into because you intend to step out of it better. Tomas brought coffee that had learned generosity from the pot it was made in. Children ran in and out of the willow's shade with the kind of laughter that makes even old grievances feel like they might be tired of themselves. Tazba finished and nodded, and that meant, begin. Shandian took Coulter's hands. "I wanted a kiss and I asked for it," she said, loud enough that women near the back could carry the sentence home like a tool. "I wanted a man to stand where Water could see him and not be ashamed. I have both. Now we will keep them." Coulter's voice broke on the first word and he didn't pretend it hadn't. "I will be what I said. When I fail, and I will get up where you can see me get up." "Good," Yazzie said, and the basin accepted the word. They kissed, not like a first, not like a last, but like a hinge doing exactly what it was made for. The willow sounded its small river speech. The spring ticked in limestone. Water remembered. Shandian smiled into Coulter's shoulder and saw the basin the way you see a road you finally know you can walk without hurrying, the Hogan and the loom and the trading post with its rebuilt porch, the jail with a new roof and fewer reasons to brag about it, the pig pen gate rehung true, the alley scraped clean of oil, the culvert armored against trickery, the fence line that had learned where it belonged. She felt her grandmother's palm on her head, light as approval. She heard Yazzie's laugh roll down the wash like a promise the land would hold him to. She felt Coulter breathe, steady, his weight where the ground could keep it. "The door opened," she said. "It did," he said. Neither of them mentioned closing it. Some doors aren't for that. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.